Hello, and welcome to Bearing Witness, the 40th anniversary of Chicago's Commission on the Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians hearing, an event hosted by the Midwest District Council and Chicago chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League. Before we get started, I would like to thank the organizing committee for this event, Bill Yoshino, Larry Schechtman, Carol Yoshino, Ross Hirano, Ron Yoshino, Lisa Doi, Rebecca Joyozaki, and Veronica Murashige. And I would like to thank you for watching as well. As we put together this commemoration and watched the many hours of testimony, I was filled with admiration at the strength of those who testified, the power of their words, and the diversity of the stories shared. Some of their words stuck with me, like Tomoharu Hachiya's question, "How do you put a whole lifetime into 5 minutes?" Shizu Lofton's description of her family before camp as we dreamed American dreams then. Or Jitsuo Morikawa, who said, "No easy redress is possible. The acts of redress must be as costly as the pain and agony of the injustice." The goal of this event is twofold. One, to serve as a record for future generations to learn about the Chicago hearing and redress, since knowing this history is critical for our ongoing civil rights work. To further this purpose, we've invited former JCL Midwest Regional Director Bill Yoshino to offer a historical overview of the hearing, which will follow my remarks. Two, to create a forum which captures the diversity of the views from those who testified, those who would or could not, and how the hearings are remembered today. In our attempts to do this, we have paired 5 of the original 1981 testimonies with 5 modern-day reflections on the testimonies and the legacy of the hearings, followed by concluding remarks from Chicago JCL President Lisa Doi. So again, thank you for watching and joining us as we commemorate the 40th anniversary of the Chicago hearing.
As we commemorate the 40th anniversary of the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians hearing in Chicago, I've been asked to provide a brief background of how these hearings came to be. Establishing this commission was an important step to challenge the government to admit wrongdoing and to provide appropriate remedies. For JACL, the first formal proposal on redress came at the 1970 convention in Chicago, where Edison Uno proposed a direct compensation bill in Congress. During his presentation, he also emphasized the need for public education and the need to tell our story. That discussion progressed in the intervening years of the 1970s until 1978, when the JACL met at its convention in Salt Lake City, which produced a redress guideline asking for $25,000 in individual compensation, an apology, and a $400 million educational trust fund. Following the Salt Lake Convention, JACL's redress leadership met with the Nikkei members of Congress, Senators Dan Inouye and Spark Matsunaga, and Representatives Norm Mineta and Bob Matsui to discuss redress legislation. At that meeting, Senator Inouye suggested the formation of a federal commission to investigate what had happened to Japanese Americans during World War II. His rationale for a commission was that the public and members of Congress had little to no knowledge about the incarceration, and that a commission could be an effective tool to provide that education. In addition to that, if properly constituted, the commission could also make a favorable recommendation on remedies. The option of going with the commission approach was controversial. The commission approach was set against a backdrop of pressure to pursue a direct compensation bill, which eventually occurred when Congressman Mike Lowry of Washington introduced such a bill on November 28, 1979. A final decision of which approach, the commission or direct compensation, was left to a JACL chapter referendum, which narrowly favored establishing a commission as a first step in seeking redress. The bill to establish a commission was introduced in the Senate by Senator Inouye on August 2, 1979. It was followed by the introduction of H.R. 5499 in the House by Congressman Norm Mineta on September 28, 1979. The effort to pass the commission legislation required a lobbying effort throughout the country, including here in the Midwest. The effort included letter writing, visits with members of Congress, the gathering of endorsements, and numerous interactions and interviews with the media. The role that the JACL Midwest District Council played in this effort was significant because among the JACL district councils, the geography of the MDC comprised the most members of Congress. I'd like to mention some of the individuals who served as redress representatives or who played a role in MDC's outreach effort during the redress campaign. From Chicago, Chie Tomohiro and Shig Wakamatsu. Cincinnati, Gordon Yoshikawa. From Cleveland, Hank Tanaka. From Dayton, Mark Nakauchi. Detroit, Dr. Kaz Maeda and Toshi Shimura. From Hoosier, Walt Nakatsukasa, Ken and Yaz Matsumoto, George and Eleanor Honosono, and most significantly, Shirley Nakatsukasa. St. Louis, it was George Sakaguchi and Chet Tanaka. From the Twin Cities, Sam Honda. Wisconsin, Alan Hida and Julius Fujihira. Many others were involved, but those mentioned stepped forward in a leadership role. The Commission House Bill, H.R. 5499, was approved with a vote of 279 to 109. The Senate's approval followed shortly thereafter. President Jimmy Carter signed the bill into law on July 31, 1980, in a ceremony in the Cabinet Room of the White House. The Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians was established with 9 members appointed by Congress and the President. Among others, the appointments included Dan Lundgren, a Republican congressman from California, Edward Brooke, a former Democratic senator from Massachusetts, Arthur Goldberg, a former Supreme Court justice, Arthur Fleming, a former chair of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, Bill Maritani, a common pleas court judge in Philadelphia, and Joan Bernstein, who served as the chair of the commission. The purpose of the commission was to review the facts and circumstances surrounding the issuance of Executive Order 9066 and its impact on citizens and permanent residents. It was also charged with recommending appropriate remedies to Congress. The Commission held 20 days of hearings on the East Coast, the West Coast, and in Chicago on September 20th, 21st, 1982, at Northeastern Illinois University. The hearings elicited testimony from over 700 Japanese Americans, including over 70 from Chicago and the Midwest. The hearings in Washington, D.C. heard testimony from some of the decision makers who oversaw the removal and incarceration. They included John J. McCloy, who served as the Assistant Secretary of War, and Carl Bendetson, who is seen as the architect of Executive Order 9066. The Commission issued its findings in a report titled Personal Justice Denied in December 1982. Among the significant findings is the following. The promulgation of Executive Order 9066 was not justified by military necessity, and the decisions which followed from it, detention, ending detention, and ending exclusion, were not driven by analysis of military conditions. The broad historical causes which shaped these decisions were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. A grave injustice was done to American citizens and resident aliens of Japanese ancestry who, without individual review or any probative evidence against them, were excluded, removed, and detained by the United States during World War II. These were powerful and unambiguous words. So that's an overview of the history of the Commission. After that, direct compensation legislation was drafted by Glenn Roberts, a member of Norm Minetta's staff. The legislation was introduced in 3 separate sessions of Congress during the 1980s until it was finally approved by Congress and signed into law as the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 by President Ronald Reagan. I'd conclude with the following. The effort to obtain redress wasn't because of a single individual or simply because of the Nikkei members of Congress. In the end, the effort was built on the historic legacy of the Nisei veterans, the individual stories of those who testified before the Commission, and the scores of individuals who told their stories to television, radio, and newspaper audiences to educate the public. The Nisei, the so-called silent generation, took it upon themselves with the support of their Issei parents, their sons and daughters, to raise their voices, in part as a catharsis to the pent-up trauma, but also in advocacy for an important cause. As we seek to give credit for the success of the redress campaign, we need look no further than the effort of our own community. In the end, the success of the redress campaign was a splendid moment and a reflection of the determination of a community. Thank you.
Mr. Roth, I hope we haven't disadvantaged you by being last.
No, not at all, Madam Chairperson. Actually, I'm here representing both the American Jewish Committee's Institute on Pluralism and Group Identity and the Illinois Consultation on Ethnicity and Education, neither of which is easy to say in one breath. The committee is this nation's pioneer human relations agency. Indeed, Mr. Goldberg is its former national president, and the Institute is the committee's research and program development arm. In Chicago, the Institute works through a unique network of issue-oriented coalitions composed of professionals in such fields as education, healthcare, and human rights, and leaders of ethnic and minority groups. The oldest and most prestigious of these coalitions is indeed the Illinois Consultation, which seeks to promote awareness of how ethnicity influences learning, teaching, and child development. I'm proud to say that among the founding members of the Illinois Consultation are Ross Serrano, former Midwest District Governor of the Japanese American Citizens League, and Dr. Myron Karapis, former Special Assistant for Ethnic Affairs to President Gerald R. Ford. Indeed, their association through the consultation led to Dr. Karapis' success in convincing President Ford to rescind Executive Order 9066 in a White House ceremony exactly 34 years after it was first signed. This was the first meaningful act undertaken by the American government aimed at correcting the massive injustice it had inflicted on people of Japanese ancestry. In the course of their friendship, Ross Serrano helped Myron Karapis understand that the incarceration was much more than an isolated Japanese-American tragedy. It was an American tragedy in which an ethnic group suffered not only severe losses, which went virtually uncompensated, as has been noted, but also emotional and psychological scars which may never heal. Dr. Karapis is a Ukrainian-American leader who understood both the larger American context in which age-old prejudices against Japanese Americans had culminated in the forced expulsion of West Coast Japanese Americans, and the emotional language of a people demanding justice. It is important that we tell and retell the story of the Japanese American incarceration. It is one of those painful recollections that becomes more compelling with each telling. And the more one tells of the expulsion and incarceration, the more one learns to ask the right questions. It is far too easy to ask such wrong questions as, why did they march off to the camps? Why did not more of them resist? What had they done to deserve such mistreatment? The right questions, the questions that all Americans must ask themselves are, why did we incarcerate them? What is our collective responsibility to redress this injustice? What can be done to prevent similar injustices from happening to others? I don't pretend to know the answer to the first question, but I still have a responsibility to ask. Each time we ask, we become wiser and perhaps a little more sensitive to the pain that America inflicted on Japanese Americans. Equally important, we may contribute to a healthier American community if by sharing the humiliation and losses suffered by people of Japanese ancestry, we can create a climate in which injustice can be faced. Then we may all be a little wiser. In my view, we should take the following action. First, support curricular programs like those in Chicago public schools and elsewhere that explore man's inhumanity to man, as it's called in Chicago. Such programs should include stories of heroism by those who were victimized, as well as stories about the righteous few, and some of that work has been noted, who at great personal expense helped Japanese Americans. We learn more from our successes than from our failures. Therefore, it is important to include material showing how Japanese Americans coped and still cope with the incarceration and its aftermath. In 1977, the Illinois consultation coined the term ethnoecology in a grant application it submitted to the U.S. Department of Education, Ethnic Studies section. The funded project produced curriculum materials on coping experiences of ethnic groups, the self-help and mutual aid associations, and the adaptive skills that flow from ethnic values and histories. We suggested that America must place a higher value on and indeed preserve this rich dimension of the human environment, much as we now protect our natural environment. Two, the federal government must take affirmative legal steps to avoid a repetition of the Japanese American incarceration. In the absence of congressionally enacted safeguards expressing the will of Congress that no arm of government shall ever again victimize a group of people on the basis of its heritage, and in light of the failure of our legal judicial system to protect Japanese Americans, there is nothing to prevent a future administration or some other governmental body from violating the rights and dignity of other groups. And Dr. Carapaz, who will testify tomorrow, will tell you some of the stories of members of the Ford administration who said, well, what happened died when the Roosevelt administration went out of office. Nonsense. It did not die, and indeed it could happen again. Three, obviously the concept of reparations will be the most difficult issue for the Commission to deal with. Part of your difficulty is fiscal and part is emotional. Many Americans find it incongruous to ask the same government that waged and won a just war to make amends for the injustice that is committed along the way. Another difficulty lies in the diversionary tactics of some critics of financial compensation who claim that the internment does not compare with the systematic destruction of European Jewry. This is a straw man argument, or as Mr. Goldberg noted, a damn red herring. Although you didn't say damn, sir, forgive me. The Japanese American incarceration is an example. The Japanese American incarceration is an example of the failure of the American system. That failure should be redressed on its own terms. We may look elsewhere for admirable examples of a nation's willingness to indemnify those it has wronged, but we should fashion an American plan that would indemnify Japanese Americans for measurable losses, many of which have been noted. In short, we must tell the story of the Japanese American incarceration as both an American tragedy and a tragedy for a particular people. We must enact laws that prevent our government from engaging in future violations of American democratic principles, and we must fashion a just indemnification formula. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roth.
David Roth was a dear friend of mine, and he was with the American Jewish Committee, and he was part of a program, a leader of the program, to organize ethnics in Chicago. One of the issues we found was that the old-time coalitions were breaking down in terms of human rights, in terms of the Jewish Committee, and in terms of African Americans. So the Illinois Ethnic Coalition was created to bring together ethnic leaders to discuss our issues. And our first meeting was brutal. We all sat around telling our stories, and everybody said, you think you had it bad, we had it bad. And as a result of that, the leadership, we got together and said, hey, we're all saying the same thing. And David was very important in terms of the hearings because through him, we're able to organize or get support from national ethnic organizations, such as the Italian American community, the Lithuanian community, the Ukrainian community, the Polish community. Because Chicago had the largest Polish population outside of Poland, the largest Lithuanian community outside of Lithuania, and also the second largest Ukrainian community. We also had a large African American community and Latino community. So this played an important role in getting national support for these various ethnic groups because there's also ethnic leaders in Congress. Frank Annunzio is Italian, for example. He's from Illinois. So this played an important role eventually in terms of the congressional support for our legislation to get redress and reparations. For many years, my whole center of activities was JACL and the Japanese American community. And I spent many years active in different local organizations and community organizations, and also, of course, JACL. And for the first time, when I met David Roth, I was able to be involved outside of my community and was able to forge a link between the Japanese American community and the many other ethnic communities in Chicago. So it's an important issue. It's important for me to learn about the other communities' issues. I was supporting my Greek friends when the Turks invaded Cyprus. So when we had our issues in terms of redress and reparations, these communities here in Chicago and nationally, these ethnic communities came out and supported our cause. I'm not taking credit for all this. All I'm saying is that it was important that the outreach that David Roth put together was very, very helpful in terms of many issues among all of our ethnic communities to at least educate the American public about our stories. And that's what the consultation did. Unfortunately, David passed away at a very young age. And the movement we still keep in touch with many of the ethnic leaders that I knew way back. And it's always been fascinating going to their events. And I've been, of course, they come to some of ours in the past too. I think that David also mentions that this is an American story. It's not a Japanese American story. It's a story of America. And that we needed to make sure that the story was being told as an American story, not as a Japanese American story, so that it affected not only our community, but other communities too who had suffered in terms of detention and suffered in terms of violation of the human and civil rights. So this was an American story. And today we see the same, we see that our movement way back has an effect, and actually, in terms of what's going on today, in terms of reparations redress being discussed by the African American community, the model that we use in terms of getting the congressional commission to come up to meet with the community and to come up with an official government report is the same model that currently is being discussed by the African American community in terms of their movement for redress and reparation. So I think that David's testimony there really was a broader stroke painting or picture of the movement for us to get redress and reparation. So the federal government report was very important because it was a document that said, that this is what a federal commission came up with. If a congressman today needed to vote on something like that, they're able to say, listen, I have a federal report that says, yes, there are injustices done. Yes, there's a need for redress. Yes, there's a need for compensation through reparations. So all of this was part of an overall strategy or overall picture that needed to be put together in terms of our success in redress and reparations for our community.
Thank you very much, sir. The next witness is Mr. Sam Ozaki. Members of the Commission, my name is Sam Ozaki. I was born in Los Angeles, California. I presently reside at 2135 West Touhy Avenue. I am presently principal of William Howard Taft High School. I'm sorry that the Honorable Arthur J. Goldberg had to leave. I was also principal at Carter H. Harrison High School, Arthur Goldberg's high school alma mater. I had prepared testimony, but after listening to Justice Goldberg last evening and the testimony of various individuals this morning and this afternoon, and then seeing my name listed under the 442nd, I decided to shorten and change my testimony because I would like to respond to some of the comments and questions raised. I'm one of those persons who volunteered for the 442nd Infantry Regimental Combat Team from a concentration camp, along with 4 good friends, Susumu Bokuro, Iso Masuda, Harry Dumbo Oda, Ted Yasunaga, and myself. We volunteered from the concentration camp Jerome. Very few volunteered from the concentration camp in Jerome, probably 20 or 30, and very understandably so. How could you expect young men to volunteer to fight for this country after this country had placed them in concentration camps? I'm always asked the question, why did you volunteer? And I think I have reasons, I'm sure the others had reasons. I would like to list 3. And certainly first and foremost, my loyalty to this country. Even though incarcerated in a concentration camp, I felt it my duty to share along with others and do my part as part of the Army. Secondly, my father I hear this every so often tonight, my father too had been picked up by the FBI and was in a separate concentration camp. I thought perhaps my volunteering would perhaps help him return to our family. And thirdly, I think we all felt it. Anything was better than staying in these lousy concentration camps. The 4 others went overseas with the original 442nd. I joined them later as a replacement. I remember November 1944, when the replacements joined the 442nd after they had pulled back from the Battle of Bruyères, the Lost Battalion. I went looking for my buddies. I found one, Ted. Harry had been in a hospital, had been sent back to a hospital with a wound. The 2 others had been killed in action, saving the Lost Battalion. I have thought of them often. I think of them now. Was it worth it? Did they die in vain? 40 years have elapsed. Time will only tell. What this commission, the actions of Congress, will tell us whether it was worth it or not. I listened to Justice Goldberg last night. I was very impressed with him. I was impressed with what he had to say. He listed 3 reasons for what happened back in 1942. Number 1, racism. Number 2, stupidity. Number 3, hysteria. Number 1, racism. I can't argue with Arthur Goldberg. That was the bottom line. That's where it all started, racism. Not only for us, but for other colored minorities, black, brown, red, and yellow. White racism. That's where it starts. Stupidity. And he talked about the stupidity of people like General DeWitt, Carl Benditson, I think he was a little kind to his colleagues on the Supreme Court, but I wouldn't include them in the stupidity too. But I would differ with him on the stupidity part. It was really not stupid. They got exactly what they wanted. They got the 120,000 Japs out of California in concentration camps. That's not so stupid. They got exactly what they wanted. Hysteria? Yeah, there was hysteria. Manufactured, well-orchestrated, created hysteria. When you add this all up, and I think it needs to be said, this amounts to a conspiracy. Whether we can ever prove it or not, that's the way I read it. I've heard the word mistake, error, quite often this evening. In my opinion, there was no mistake, there was no error. It was a calculated act with many persons reaching all levels of this government to do exactly what happened. Justice Goldberg also mentioned that in the Korematsu case, that if the lawyers had used the 14th Amendment as opposed to the 5th Amendment, that perhaps a different outcome might have been reached. I don't believe it. That court was stacked with Roosevelt appointees. A decision was made before they even found the rationale. Regardless, 5th Amendment, 14th Amendment, they would have found the rationale they needed. I would like to respond to Senator Brooke earlier this afternoon. He talked about the Japanese Americans, how well off they are. Senator Brooke, it is completely irrelevant how well off, how poor, whatever. A wrong is a wrong, an injustice, and as Justice Goldberg mentioned the other evening, an injustice continues. It is completely irrelevant. And number two, I'm sure there are many persons of Japanese ancestry who perhaps at the poverty level or perhaps at the bare subsistence level, I'm sure they would not come forth and say, because they have too much pride, that we are not making it. There are people who are suffering, who have suffered. And thirdly, and most important, the dollar sign. That's the bottom line. Even if this commission were to go to Congress, even if the Congress were to adopt a resolution signed by the President, acknowledging not a mistake, but a wrong, a crime, as Justice Goldberg said, there must be a dollar sign attached to it. That's what it's about in America, the dollar sign. The values of America mean money. Unless you have a dollar sign, attached to it, it is meaningless, it is worthless, just as either McCloy or Stimson said when they talked about the Constitution, it's just a scrap of paper during wartime. In terms of redress, I would like to see, again, some acknowledgement by this government of the crime committed back in 1942. I would like to see, whether it's legislation, amendment, or otherwise, to see that this does not happen again to any individual, any group. This is for all Americans. I think an educational process is important. As a principal of William Howard Taft High School just this past April, I talked to them about 40 years ago, I was a senior at Banning High School, just like you, a senior looking forward to graduation, all the other things, but it did not happen because I was in a concentration camp. Just this evening, while appearing on Channel 7, just before going on, I happened to be talking to some of the young people who work there. I talked to them about the concentration camp. What concentration camp? They were totally ignorant of the concentration camps. I would venture to say 95-98% of all Americans are completely ignorant. This is one of the best kept secrets of America. So an education process has to take place and the real truth has to be told about the many individuals and their involvement. And thirdly, monetary redress. I would suggest a minimum, and that's a pittance, a minimum of $25,000, some kind of formula developed so that individuals will be compensated accordingly. Finally, I would like to end with the words of Karl Schurz, eminent German immigrant, who said, "My country, if right, to be kept right, if wrong, to be set right. Our country was wrong, it must be set right, not only for us, but for all Americans." I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ozaki.
Hey everyone, my name's Philip Ozaki. I use he, him pronouns. I'm based in San Francisco and the second grandson of Sam and Haru Ozaki.
Hey everyone, Rebecca Joy Ozaki. I use she, her pronouns. I'm in Chicago and I am the only granddaughter of Sam and Haru Ozaki.
Hi, I'm James Ozaki. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the youngest grandchild of Sam and Haru Ozaki, and I currently live in New York City.
Thank you everyone for having us on this anniversary of such a significant time in the reparations movement. The way we've organized this is we'll each ask one question to our siblings. And I have the first question, which is, it's been 40 years since Grandpa gave testimony. How has his legacy carried on within you today?
I'll start. So for me, I grew up, just like you two, going with him and Grandma to community events. And I was able, in so many spaces to listen to Grandpa speak and share his story and his experiences during World War II. And honestly, just hearing him speak and having conversations with him, he's really helped me find my own voice. So now I'm a social worker, end-of-life doula, and a community organizer. So the way that his legacy is carried on with me is that I organize elders in Chicago around issues of care. We run healing circles to address things like intergenerational trauma, and we record the stories of our elders as well to share the issues that matter to them and their experiences. So I feel like all of those values I've learned from Grandpa, and something I'm trying to carry on in intergenerational work.
For me, it'd be to continue writing songs about our family stories, our grief, our trauma, because I think it's really important to put those into personal art forms. And I also am going to continue sharing our story throughout my workplace. I currently work in human resources and diversity and inclusion. So looking at how a lot of labor practices affected Japanese Americans, like my grandpa, we came to Chicago because that's where he could find work. And so those types of labor practices are really important to communities and their histories.
A couple years ago, I was working in the business sector and I was living in Europe, and I had to make a few difficult life decisions. And one of them was that I wanted to work in social justice again, in the name and spirit of my grandparents. And so that's how right now I'm the development director here at JCL. And it's so serendipitous because Grandpa, he was the first Asian American principal and an educator here in Chicago. And right now I'm organizing our Centennial Education Fund campaign that celebrates our 100 years working in education for this story. So, yeah.
So all of us have seen different bits and pieces of Grandpa's testimony before, but since it's the anniversary, this is the first time we're able to discuss it actually together, and it holds different weight. What did you discover from watching Grandpa's testimony?
I think for me, Becky, it was that Grandpa just never stuttered when he would use the words concentration camp as opposed to internment camp, or when he would call out white racists who wanted Japanese people to be gone, or when he would make a call to action that the right way forward for America was to give reparations in financial terms. So Grandpa never stuttered, and it's a call for me to, when I'm working at JCL, to continue asking powerfully for what I believe in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that for sure. And for me, what I discovered was that, every time that Grandpa says part of the reason he joined the 442, one of the reasons was that perhaps then his father, who was taken from the FBI, or great grandfather, would be returned to their family. That's the part that really hits home for me. And I think about like the intergenerational trauma and how that impacts our family today, the way families were split apart, including our own during that time, and could barely really know each other, after the war. It's something that still happens today. And I think about that and how it's crucial that healing from that harm happens today still, because 40 years later, we need to be intentional about what that looks like.
Thanks, Becky. And for me, in relation to Phil's point, calling out systemic racism, the white racism, the stupidity not being stupidity, but intentional because they got exactly what they want, and the hysteria that was orchestrated through the media, concentration camps versus internment. I think Grandpa was ahead of his time. And I also think for us, him calling it out so directly and leaving no room for any other interpretation of the statement helped erase the shame of being Japanese through his testimony. And I think that's a huge burden to lift after being so, I guess, weighed down by the fact that he was in prison because he was of Japanese ancestry. And a second, it really sparked a question to me on the topic of Grandpa's loyalty and duty to the U.S. that drove him to join the 442, amongst other reasons, but it made me wonder what that loyalty and duty would look like in today's society, now that social justice and civil rights do have more structure and power behind it to support people who are put in that situation. And so the last question we have is, we're just going to share some of our final thoughts. So Becky and Phil, what are your final thoughts for everyone?
At that time, not a lot of Americans knew about our story, and now a lot more do, but that we have far more ways to go, especially sharing that Japanese Americans were given reparations, and at the very least, the ancestors of formerly enslaved people deserve a commission for themselves.
Yeah, when I reflect on what Grandpa said in this hearing, I think about like the way he chose to show up for not only his community, but for other communities of color, like the Black community, like Phil said. I think that that's like kind of what I'm leaving with, that I feel more so then to this country, a loyalty to my community and the people that have been part of my life and supported me through these years, including the Japanese American community. And I think about what Grandpa would do now in terms of the injustices that are happening today. I feel like he'd be marching with us at these rallies, and I definitely feel his presence in those spaces. So I'm just trying to think about what it means to be an ally and to show up for those that, that need support right now.
And for me, I mostly remember Grandpa in our personal interactions as mild, modest, and steadfast. He was always on time and willing to support us, like picking us up from school, driving us to church, coming to all our shows and birthdays. But in this clip, I saw him be bold and audacious. And like I mentioned earlier, he was calling it like it is, and even shifted his response from whatever he had written originally. And so for me, I see when calling things out, it takes a lot of tact and wisdom, like he did with his words, amongst the rest of his life going on around him. And so first, thanks to Becky and Phil for sharing your points of view. I'm the youngest, so I haven't experienced everything the same way. And thank you to Chicago JCL and the Midwest District for the opportunity to reflect on our grandpa Sam Ozaki's legacy and giving his testimony for the Commission on Wartime, Relocation, and Internment of Civilians. Thanks for tuning in.
I am Mitzi Shio Schechtman, and I reside with my husband in Chicago, Illinois. I am the youngest of 7 daughters of Shozo and Suru Shio. The testimony I submit to this commission concerns the events due to evacuation that led to the separation of my father from his family at a time when he was seriously ill. My father arrived in Seattle, Japan from Tottori, Japan in May 1907. In his early years in America, his work was on the railroads and in the lumber camps. 4 years after his own immigration, he was able to send for my mother, who came to the United States in 1911. He put roots down in this country. He worked hard and he provided for his family. In 1941, we opened a new florist shop, which represented 34 years of my father's own sacrifice and labor. At the time the war started, he was ill with cancer, but was being cared for at home. The family made a decision when Executive Order 9066 was issued. We wanted to avoid virtual imprisonment, and we did not know if the relocation centers would have adequate medical facilities where my father could receive complete care when it became necessary. Through the help of a close family friend, we purchased a small house near Pasco, Washington, in the eastern part of the state. Voluntary evacuation from the Seattle area was prohibited by then. However, the Army said that because of his condition, a special travel permit would be issued to my father to go to Pasco. We were also told that the remaining family members, including my mother, had to be processed into the Puyallup Assembly Center, but would be allowed to join him in Pasco after a few weeks. On April 28, 1942, my father left us. He was driven to Pasco by my brother-in-law, Charles Johnson, who remained with him. The day following his departure, the rest of us were interned in Puyallup. Because we were certain that our stay there would be brief, we carried even less than other families. Once in the center, repeated requests to join him were denied. It was useless to protest that Army authorities had led us to believe we could do so. I cannot describe our anguish and bitterness. We were helpless in camp while my father, near the close of his life, was being deprived of the comfort and solace of his family. In the next 2 months, my father's health worsened, and the strain of worry about the family also took a heavy toll. Anti-Japanese pressures in Pasco began to build, and they received overt threats of violence. The sheriff finally told them that they should leave for their own safety, so they abandoned the house, taking only a few personal belongings. Thus, his second exodus began, taking him even further away from the family. Charles, who had a relative in Madison, Wisconsin, started driving there, still hopeful that the family would soon be released. My father was more realistic. They traveled as far as Boise, Idaho, where now in severe and constant pain, he begged to be taken back to my mother. He knew we could not come to him, so he had to come to us. Consequently, he was taken back to Puyallup and placed in the camp hospital. Charles then continued to Wisconsin by himself. In September 1942, we were transferred to Minidoka, Idaho. My father lived for 2 more weeks and died on September 19, 1942. His was the first recorded death in Minidoka. A funeral service was hastily arranged, held in a camp recreation hall, to which my mother and family were transported in the back of an army truck. After his death, my sister Nami spent many long, weary hours in the administration office seeking permission to take his body to Salt Lake City, Utah, where the nearest crematory was located. My mother's last gesture to him would not be burial beneath the sagebrush in the desert. Authorization was finally given, and my mother and sisters Nami and Doris accompanied him by train from Twin Falls, Idaho to Salt Lake City. When their mission was completed, they returned to camp. By the end of July 1943, we had left Minidoka. The family relocated to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My mother, who is now 94, still resides there, and 4 of my sisters have also made it their permanent home. My father's ashes are interred in a cemetery plot in Milwaukee. I would like to end my testimony by speaking briefly about the aftermath of evacuation. The uncertain period of resettlement was not easy for my family. My older sisters worked at low-paying jobs. For 4 years, we lived in a 1-bedroom apartment that housed 5 of us. The secure foundation built over the years had been destroyed. The family had to start our lives over again, much the way my father did when he made his choice to come to America. There was a difference, however. He left his old life to begin a new one in a spirit of hope and eager to face the future. The family, exiles in our own country, started the slow process of rebuilding, but we could not look ahead. We could deal only with the present and try to forget the past.
My name is Larry Scheckman, and I was the husband of Mitzi Scheckman, who you just heard testify. Mitzi's testimony was part of a panel of 4 or 5 individuals who spoke on the subject of impact on health, which was one of 31 panels that were set up by the commission staff for the Chicago hearings. I was a member of the chapter committee that helped set up the hearings, and I was part of the ushering people who helped everyone get seated, although that probably wasn't needed very much. But I was there for the hearings, and I must say that my first reaction, I can remember very well, my first reaction to listening to Mitzi was one of great pride. She told the tragic story of her father's death from the evacuation time in April of 1942 until she left Minidoka in June of 1943. That was 15 months of internment for Mitzi and her mother. The point I'm trying to make is that it took 15 to 20 years for the family to regain its sense of security after moving to the Midwest. In fact, it was a generation lost. But like the majority of the Nikkei community, the experiences that that Mitzi's family had were common. The loss of home, the loss of business, the loss of personal property, the mental numbness of helplessness, the fear, I guess, of the unknown. Mitzi, in her testimony, referred to her family as exiles in their own country. From my background, we talked about the family and relatives and the news reports about the refugees in Europe. Both phrases are probably wrong. And there was another phrase in World War II that referred to people as DPs, or displaced persons. In the case of exiles and refugees, they leave the country. Either they're required to leave or they want to leave. But in the case of displaced persons, they choose to stay in their own country to find safety and security. So in fact, the settlers, the Japanese American resettlers, were DPs, displaced persons in their own country, who eventually either moved to the West Coast, the East Coast, or went back on their own volition to the West Coast. In either case, it took a generation to recover their security and their base of family. And we should never forget that is the core, the basic core of the community who put together the hearings in Chicago and acted as a so-called usher to help people get seated around the room, which was hardly necessary. But I was able to stand there and watch and listen for 2 days. And I can tell you that it was a solemn atmosphere, not sad, not mad, nobody had placards, nobody was jumping up, there was no clapping, there was no laughing. Everybody was very, very serious and intent about what they were listening to. After all, the people who were testifying about grievances that the community had felt for 40 years and not been able to speak and hear these truths of their grievances, of what actually went on. This was a telling of truth to power. And you were talking to the highest authority in the country, the United States Congress. And these people were hearing their complaints, their problems spoken in open commission hearings to the Congress of the United States. It was serious stuff, and everybody was rapt and attentive. In the books that you read, you sometimes hear the word cathartic use, and to agree that is what happened after the hearings, that all of this pent up grievance was finally exposed and presented properly. So that is another part of the hearings. 2 days of solemn hearings. After achieving some form of survival, the family staying together and some security came, thoughts about community and citizenship and redress, well, then they were acceptable and we could talk about them a little more freely. When redress was finally made law by President Reagan and the checks and the apology letter arrived, it was as if a large weight had been lifted from the shoulders of the family and the Nikkei community. They were proven as good citizens. They were proven right as good citizens. The government was proven wrong, as they always knew. When I think of Mitzi's testimony and that of the other people at the panel, I am filled today the same as I was in 1981, with a great deal of pride. Thank you.
My name is Toru Ishiyama. Parma, Ohio is my home. I was living in Alameda, California with my mother and 2 younger sisters when we were evacuated first to Tanforan Assembly Center, then eventually to Topaz, Utah. When it became clear that this commission was going to be formed, I resolved early to testify about the psychological impact of the relocation. Consequently, I began a rather intensive search of the scientific literature. I started with the year 1981, went back 39 years to the year 1942, looking for something that had something to do with the psychological impact of the American concentration camp experience. To my amazement, my search produced absolutely very little, absolutely nothing, as a matter of fact. And a very interesting question is raised. Why? Why this vacuum? How come the Japanese American social scientists, and there are many, and their colleagues did not flood the literature with psychological studies and analyses? What is it in the American concentration camp experience that has taken it out of the psychological field of both its victims and the scientific community? Now, generally, 4 factors are, by the way, I'm a psychologist. I begin to talk like a shrink, and I hope you'll forgive me. Generally, 4 factors are seen as common to the concentration camp, prisoner of war, and hostage experiences. And these are: 1, life-endangering factors; 2, prolonged helplessness; 3, recurrent terrifying episodes; and finally, assaults on self-esteem and self-image. Now, one may argue the relative rank of the American concentration camp on the first 3 variables. It is my conviction that what really characterizes the American concentration camp was the assault on the self-esteem and self-image. And from a psychological perspective, I add a greater assault. And I call this the assault of abandonment by one's own country, which, like the dripping water torture, may be the most pernicious, pervasive, and debilitating onslaught on one's identity. It was this assault, in my opinion, which launched the Japanese Americans on a 40-year journey to gain the external validation of respect. They lost an internal validation, so we had to go out and get this external validation of respect in terms of success. The focus on external validation, therefore, negated self-analysis and introspection, hence the self-imposed knowledge gap. But what about the non-Japanese colleagues? Now, they wrote about the social, economic, political, constitutional issues, but they didn't write about psychological issues. And it's my opinion, again my opinion, that maybe psychological issues are too personal, too close. To get close is to begin to feel, to understand on a very human basis. And this may lead to an uncomfortable feeling of guilt. Or perhaps we Japanese Americans played our stoic, untouchable role too well and fooled everybody, including ourselves. What we have then now are thousands of psychological studies locked up in each of the victims. And in order to change that, I'd like to present a brief psychological analysis of my personal experiences. I need to point out that nothing dramatic happened to me. I'm just one of these average Taro Blow Japanese Americans. But I think it's interesting because I do think that I am kind of average and therefore may be representative. I'd like to present my personal history in terms of both a personal and a professional perspective. And I will attempt to do so in terms of a series of simple, clear-cut explanatory concepts. And the first concept is, the greater the dissonance, the greater the effort required to achieve consonance. Okay, the values of loyalty and trustworthiness were at the core of what my parents tried to instill in me. And when you combine this with an almost religious acceptance of the Constitution or the principles underlying the Constitution of the United States, you get a super patriot. And I was a super patriot. When I was a kid, I remember, when the national anthem was sung, I would get kind of tearful, all choked up, and shivers run up my spine, and boy, I was ready to fight anybody. In my senior year, for example, I entered a number of oratorical contests, the title of which was, quote, "Why I Am Proud to Be an American." And I really, really was proud to be an American at that time. Principle 2, when dissonance occurs, that is, when one's perception or expectation and reality is not congruent, then consonance or congruence is pursued in terms of a variety of ego defense mechanisms that distort reality. Okay, when it became clear that the military was going to move the Japanese out, I insisted, I was convinced that I wasn't going to be moved because I was a citizen and my citizenship would protect me. That was my defense. Obviously, my citizenship did not save me. I was ejected from my country and detained in the middle of a vast, barren, and unwelcoming desert. And in the middle of that desert, a crazy psychological process was set in motion. I could deal with a lot of things. I could deal with hardships. I could deal with the physical discomforts, but I couldn't deal with the psychological assault of being in a prison without being guilty of any crime. So something in me said, hey, don't be aware of the fence. If the fence ain't there, you're not in jail. In the 2 years that I was in Topaz, I never went near the fence. I didn't see the fence until I left. Now, the avoidance and denial works well, and it worked well until the loyalty questionnaire. The demand for a written statement of loyalty was the assault that broke the denial's back. And I couldn't avoid the issue anymore. If my country was indeed just, if it respected me, what in the hell was I doing here? Why was I being subjected to this? It's almost as if my mother had said, hey, I will acknowledge you as my son if after I defile you and debase you and eject you, you will swear that you will fight for me. When denial fails, obviously anxiety and despair is heightened. Principle 3. Principle 5. The consequences of psychological assault can be multi-generational. Now, studies have indicated that first and second generation offsprings of the Holocaust survivors are being still affected by that experience, by the experience of their grandparents. In the same way, I am convinced that the impact of my experience has been reflected in the way I've reared my children, in the way I served as a role model, in the way I both consciously and unconsciously shape my kids. The pervasive fear, and I still have that, the fear that it might happen again, has been transmitted to my progeny, for their question is, what will it take to make it happen again? And in probably more subtle ways, the guilt which results from the introjection of hostility is also transmitted. The fact that Japanese Americans haven't shown up in the psychiatrist's office in great numbers does not indicate an absence of pain. I think it simply indicates or provides testimony to the tremendous strengths of the Japanese American victim who refused to be victimized. Now, I'm saying all this not simply to make a statement, nor to bare my soul, or to bring my soul under psychological scrutiny. I'm saying this because I really want this country never again to abandon its children, never again to turn on its own, and that it be true to the principles which I thought and still think can make it great. I have a number of recommendations based upon what I think ought to be the underlying principle. I know there have been issues about, well, Japanese Americans may be fairly affluent, they don't need the money. I'd like to place the emphasis not so much on compensation, but on deterrence. And the only way you're going to deter, there are a number of ways to do it. One way is to make it painful, make it expensive. So if you would ask me, what do I think the redress amount ought to be, I'm saying it ought to be big enough to be painful. If it's a reasonable payment, it ain't painful. If it's reasonable and not painful, then it's not a deterrent. And I think that ought to be the principle. I have a number of other things, but I think I've overspent my time, so you can read it in my recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Ishiyama powerfully described the psychological impacts of incarceration. Decades later, my own research with post-war Sansei and Yonsei generations has supported his observations about potential multi-generational legacies of this wartime trauma. Many of these psychological impacts emerge through the ways in which the Nisei parented their children. One way to protect their children was to avoid talking about the camps altogether, or to refer to what happened in only brief and evasive ways. Nisei parents explained that they avoided mentioning the camps to spare their children from being upset or burdened by the past, and to avoid dwelling on their own negative experiences. However, this avoidance created a sense of foreboding in the Sansei that camp was something too painful or too shameful to be talked about. One of my interviewees described it as being like a family secret, like a relative who is alcoholic, everyone knows but tiptoes around it. The silence meant that the Sansei grew up experiencing a troubling gap in their personal history. In hopes of avoiding anti-Japanese backlash, a second Nisei protective parenting approach was to downplay Japanese culture and language and to emphasize blending into mainstream American society. Fitting in also meant urging that the Sansei avoid doing anything that might bring negative attention to themselves, their family, or the community, and to be high-achieving and reflect positively on all these levels. As a result, Sansei experienced a disconnection from their Japanese heritage and identity, and a self-consciousness that somehow being Japanese was not positive. As they learned more about the wrongful imprisonment that their families endured, Sansei also grappled with a lack of confidence in the US government, creating a kind of double bind. They had doubts about the Japanese identity, but at the same time had doubts about American identity. Emotionally, many have also carried a legacy of sadness and anger about what happened, and the recognition that the incarceration prevented their mother or father from reaching their full potential. These emotions motivated some Sansei to fulfill their parents' lost dreams and aspirations by pursuing a degree or a career that the parent had missed. Others entered into law or community activism to help prevent future injustices. Despite these negatives, a positive impact has been the Sansei's pride in their Nisei's parents as role models of resilience and endurance. My current research asked over 500 Yonsei, fourth generation Japanese Americans, about incarceration impacts in their lives. Preliminary findings suggest psychological impacts similar to those described by the Sansei. Most prominent among Yonsei responses was the continued impact of incarceration on identity. One wrote, "It haunts me and follows me everywhere. Becomes especially apparent when I think about my place in America in relation to my ethnic background." And another shared, "I am mixed race and don't always feel like I belong. But then when I think about the intergenerational trauma I suffered, I know who I am." Like the Sansei, most Yonsei also feel the loss of connection to their Japanese heritage and continued family silence around the camp experience. As one Yonsei shared, There is a lot about my family I don't know because the incarceration feels like a topic too sensitive to broach. It feels like a long time of our family was erased or obscured. Less frequent, but still worth noting, are Yonsei reports of current intergenerational family struggles that they link to a grandparent's incarceration. These include physical and emotional abuse, depression, alcoholism, anxiety, emotional volatility, and emotional distance. Similar to the Sansei generation, however, Yonsei also express pride about their grandparents' resilience and note that this helps them to put their own struggles into context. Importantly, many Yonsei in my research see the incarceration as sparking a commitment to social justice. As one explained, because of the injustices Japanese and Japanese Americans faced, I feel that I have an obligation to speak out against all injustice and stand in solidarity with the oppressed. In his commission testimony, Dr. Ishiyama stated, "I am saying this because I really want this country to never again abandon its children, never again to turn on its own. While we must be mindful of the multi-generational camp legacies that continue, the strong focus on social justice shared by many Yonsei today offers hope that similar abandonments can be avoided."
Mr. Sam Shiraga.
For the record, there is two errors of this program. One, although I am a veteran of MIS, my oral testimony does not cover this period of my life. Also, although the name Sam is a very nice name, for the official record, my name is Cheryl F. Shiraga. Members of the Commission, on January 28, 1942, I graduated from Gardena, California High School as an honors student. It was my privilege to give the graduating class commencement address. It was, I believe, a stirring address by an 18-year-old starry-eyed kid, expounding a need for loyalty and patriotism during this wartime crisis, highlighting the meaning of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. It was filled with exhortation about our great nation and what it stood for: freedom, liberty, justice under the law for all. As graduating seniors, it was our duty to go forth into the real world, shouldering our responsibilities and fight for its preservation. In late February or early March of 1942, I inquired about joining the Army and was told that Japanese Americans were not needed. I tried a Merchant Marine Officer Training Academy and was similarly advised. On April 12, 1942, 10 weeks after my patriotic commencement address, I sat on an Army cot in the middle of a horse stable, behind barbed wire fence and armed guards, finally realizing how naive and stupid I had been. Needless to say, my attitude toward my captors, the United States government, had changed drastically. I would cooperate as long as I felt it was in my best interest. That patriotism and all that other jazz about freedom, liberty, and justice for all was no longer of interest to me. It did not apply to me, a Japanese American, and I no longer could believe or trust in it. Some 39 years later, as I reflect on my incarceration and how it affected my life, I know that for years I was angry, bitter, and vindictive. As I grew older, I finally accepted the reality that this is far from a perfect society that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights would like to purport. Although disillusioned and resentful as a youth, I acknowledge that this country and its society have helped and given many of us a chance to pick up our broken lives and become a successful and useful contributor to our society. However, there are many among us who have suffered greatly from this injustice and are in need and entitled to some economic redress. They lost everything and were unable to recover, and today have little or nothing. I hope that Congress and the President of the United States will address this matter, though very difficult in this political climate, as statesmen and not political survivors, before it becomes meaningless to those in need. I, for one, seek nothing material, although I believe I am entitled to reparation that is more than just mere tokenism. Naive as I was in totally believing in the teachings of my civic classes of high school years, I cannot completely ignore the basic foundation of freedom, liberty, and justice for all on which this nation, imperfect as it may be, was founded. To me, redress would best be served if the Congress would appropriate sufficient funds to create a lasting monument at each of the 10 permanent imprisonment centers where 110,000 Japanese Americans, like myself, were incarcerated from early 1942 until the last center was closed in 1946. The monument should be as large and as durable as the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Apology by Congress in reality is meaningless, except for the small satisfaction of the current survivors of this infamy. Today's history book may record this period in our society possibly in one chapter, 50 years from now in one paragraph, and 100 years from now probably forgotten. A monument the size and durability of the Great Pyramids of Egypt would last for thousands of years and stick out like a Thor's thumb. It might continually remind the members of our society that yes, it did happen in these United States of America, and it can and probably will happen again. So beware, you may be the next one. Thank you very much.
All right, hello everyone. I want to start off by thanking Eric Langowski, Lisa Doy, and the JACL Chicago for the invitation and opportunity to take part in this event commemorating the 30th anniversary of the redress hearings held in Chicago. And I'm really honored to be a part of this and to join you. So the testimonies we're viewing today comprise part of a long series of official hearings and an even longer standing social movement that sought recognition for the Japanese American incarceration or internment as a grave racist injustice. And while it's crucial to recognize the achievement of these testimonies and the social movement that delivered the hearings in the first place, I think it is equally important to recognize the pitfalls of asking the very state that committed the injustice of internment for redress. This contradictory structure shaped the contours of the testimonies as well as the limits of redress itself. And we can see this influence in Shiro Shiraga's testimony. He narrates a story of belief in the United States as an exceptional democracy that gets shattered by his unjust racist imprisonment, treated no better than the animals whose stable he was forced to inhabit during the relocation. Mr. Shiroga tells us how he went from being a loyal American and top of his high school class to being an enemy of his own country, from a young man who wanted to enlist in the military to serve his country to one who was subjected to sleeping on army cots by the military. And yet he recuperates the US in his appeal for reparations payments and memorials to the camps. He reverts to praising the US as a place where anyone, even though subjected to racist, militarized incarceration, can become, quote, successful and useful contributors to our society. Shiroga's testimony reflects the strategy of the redress movement overall, one that posited the racism Japanese Americans endured during World War II as an aberration or grave mistake by an otherwise just and welcoming nation. By framing internment as an exception to US history rather than absolutely continuous with US history, the redress movement ultimately shored up the very power of the state that redress sought to challenge. And it is for this reason that, against Shiroga's hopes that redress might prevent such an injustice again, we see the exact opposite. We see the proliferation of camp imprisonment of those racial others cast out and demonized by the United States, whether Muslims in Guantanamo, Latin Americans torn from their children and detained in filthy camps, or Haitians detained over the decades in camps and detention centers, and now literally whipped by Border Patrol agents on horseback. The US state, as perpetrator of the Japanese American incarceration, cannot redeem itself with this one act of redress. Instead, it must enact real change. It must abandon its foundational commitments to white supremacy, state power, and imperialism. Because it has yet to alter these foundations on which internment was built, redress will remain incomplete. Its unfinished business endures. As Shiroga notes in his skepticism that it can and probably will happen again, true redress would prevent such violence against other groups cast out by the US people and government. And we can see the continued work of redress in current social movements like Suru for Solidarity, in which formerly incarcerated Japanese Americans use their ethical position as camp survivors and their descendants to fight for the freedom of migrants held under US detention. So it is my hope that all of us, regardless of our family or social backgrounds, will take up this struggle for the liberation of all peoples. If redress for internment is possible at all, it will come not from the US state, but from us, from our work in solidarity with each other. Thank you very much.
"40 years ago, over 100 Japanese Americans and others testified before the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians in Chicago. I appreciate being able to hear those testimonies alongside our contemporary reflections. I appreciate that we got to hear from the loved ones of those who testified, like Larry Sheckman and the Ozaki grandchildren, people who spent their careers studying the hearings and the impact of incarceration, like Donna Nagata and Naomi Paik, and those who put their efforts into the redress movement and other fights for equal rights, like Bill Yoshino and Ross Hirano. On this 40th anniversary, we look back on a pivotal moment in Japanese American history. As Bill and Ross reminded us, the commission hearings in Chicago were remarkably important in getting the US government to acknowledge and apologize for the wartime incarceration. At the same time, scholars like Drs. Nagata and Paik offered important reminders that the repair promised by the redress movement did not end with the signing of the Civil Liberties Act. I would suggest that the commissioners got some things wrong. I do not think their three causes, race prejudice, war hysteria, and failure of political leadership, are correct. With the benefit of hindsight, I feel that the commission had a specific task: to narrowly define the Japanese American incarceration experience into an anomalous rupture, and to clearly scope the trauma into something that could be redressed. But I think the patterns of dispossession, displacement, and removal of people of color, from the settling of this country to redlining, Chinese exclusion, Indian boarding schools, to contemporary detention and mass incarceration, make it clear that what happened to Japanese Americans was not war hysteria. It was not a unique failure of political leadership. It was race prejudice, a prejudice that we continue to suffer from. By no means do I mean to suggest that the Commission and the broader redress movement were unsuccessful. I think the US government did what it was capable of doing, while still being a state that relies on racial violence. What I am most appreciative of is that community leaders, like those you heard from today, and community members were able to use the redress movement as a turning point in a process of community healing that has always begun and ended with us. On this 40th anniversary, we look ahead to the ways that Japanese Americans have and will continue to be part of a larger project of racial healing. Nikkei from Chicago and across the country are supportive of Black-led movements for reparations, from local legislation in Evanston to the federal H.R. 40 bill. We must continue to support these fights, and we must, yet again, be ready for a project of repair beyond what the government can offer. We must gather in solidarity, in community, in a process of racial healing. This is how I want to commemorate this 40th anniversary. Thank you so much for joining JACL Chicago and the Midwest District Council today. If you're watching this live on September 25th and are able to join us, we'll be having a Zoom discussion and talkback that will begin now. If you have not already registered, there is a link in the video description for you to be able to join us. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.